The word came out of the duty officer's mouth like he was doing her a favor. Maintenance doesn't fly combat. He didn't shout it. That's the part one want you to sit with, because the loud ones are easy to dismiss, and this man wasn't loud. He said it the way you'd correct a child who'd wandered into the wrong room. Patient, almost kind, the kindness of a man who has already decided you are not the thing you think you are and is gently bringing you up to speed. He had a clipboard in one hand and a coffee going cold in the other, and behind him on the big board the weather was painted in colors that pilots learned to read the way the rest of us read a stop sign. Red. Magenta. The colors that mean no. And in front of him stood a woman in a flight suit that fit her like it had been earned, with a Labrador sitting at her left heel, so still you could have mistaken him for furniture, and she did not move when the word landed. She'd heard it before. That's the thing about a word like that, maintenance, said the way he said it. It isn't information. It's a fence. It's a way of telling someone exactly how far the world has decided they're allowed to go, and she'd spent a career bumping up against that particular fence, and she knew its height to the inch. There's a team down, she said. 6 souls. The window closes in 40 minutes. I'm aware of the window. Then you're aware nobody's going to make it if we wait for the front to break. I'm aware of that too. He set the coffee down. He looked at her and then, and this is the part that some of the men standing around that operations shack would remember for the rest of their lives, the part they'd tell wrong later to make themselves sound better. He looked down at the dog. At the Labrador sitting at her heel with his ears up and his amber eyes fixed on the middle distance, like he was already somewhere none of them could follow. And leave the dog, the officer said. This isn't a petting zoo. Go sit down, Chief. Let the real pilots handle the weather call. Let me stop the clock right there, because I want you to understand what had already happened in that room before any helicopter left the ground. 4 pilots had already said no. 4 combat aviators, every one of them, men and women with thousands of hours and chests full of the things you get for flying into places that try to kill you. They had walked up to that same board, looked at that same magenta wall of weather sitting between the flight line and a downed team bleeding out under it, and they had each made the same call. Unflyable. And I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about cowardice, and those 4 were not cowards. They were professionals. The book said no. The radar said no. Every instrument and every regulation and every hard-won instinct that keeps a pilot alive long enough to grow old said the same thing the duty officer was saying: you do not fly into that. They were right, by every measure anyone in that room knew how to use. And that is exactly the problem with the measures we know how to use. They're built from the average of everything that's ever happened. They're the accumulated wisdom of every pilot who ever died doing the thing the book now tells you not to do. And the book is almost always right. It's right so often that being right becomes the whole point of it, and somewhere in there the book stops being a tool and starts being a wall, and the wall doesn't care that there are 6 people on the other side of it who are going to die in the next 40 minutes. The book didn't fly. The book sat on a shelf. And the woman they just told to go sit down had spent more hours under the belly of the aircraft on that flight line than most of those 4 pilots had spent in the seat of it. Because that's who she was. That's the thing the word maintenance was built to hide. Her name was Chief Warrant Officer Lynn Gwynn, and before she ever held a cyclic she had held a torque wrench, and she had held it for 9 years. I want to give you that number slowly. 9 years. Most people in this story, the 4 pilots, the duty officer, the brass who'd hear about all of this later and decide what it meant, most of them thought of flying as the real job and the wrench as the thing you did before you got promoted to the real job. But Nguyen never saw it that way, and the difference in how she saw it is the entire reason 6 people came home that night. A pilot flies the aircraft. Nguyen knew the aircraft. There's a gap between those 2 verbs wide enough to fly a helicopter through, and most people never notice it. She had been elbow deep in that exact airframe at 2 in the morning with a flashlight in her teeth, learning the specific way that specific machine complained before it failed, the particular shudder it gave at the edge of its tolerances that no manual described because no manual is written by the hands that actually held the metal. She knew where the book's numbers had margin built in and where they didn't. She knew the difference between the airframe can't take this and the airframe isn't supposed to take this, and those are not the same sentence, and the gap between them that night was the gap between 6 funerals and 6 homecomings. The book is written for the average pilot flying the average airframe in the average condition. Nguyen wasn't average, the airframe she'd request wasn't average, and the night was the furthest thing from average there is. She'd cross-trained into the seat the hard way, the slow way, the way that earns you respect from exactly nobody because you came up through the maintenance bay instead of the academy pipeline, and she carried that with her the way you carry a stone in your boot, Not loud, not complaining, just always there, always reminding you that to a certain kind of person you will never be the real thing no matter how many hours you log. To that kind of person you will always be just a tech who learned a party trick. She'd made peace with it. Mostly. The way you make peace with a fence you can't move, you stop pushing on it and you just learn its height and you live inside it. But there were 6 people on the other side of the weather, and a fence is a fence right up until the moment it isn't. And then there was the dog. The duty officer had told her to leave him, and I want to tell you about the thing the duty officer didn't know, because it's the kind of thing that men with clipboards almost never know, and it's the kind of thing that turns out, in the end, to matter more than the clipboard. His name was Maverick. He was a black Labrador going gray around the muzzle, and he was retired, a former military working dog, an explosives detection animal who'd done his time downrange and earned the right to sleep through the rest of his life on a soft bed and never hear another rotor blade as long as he lived. He'd earned that. By every measure of what a dog is owed, he'd earned the quiet. But Maverick didn't go for the quiet. Because somewhere in his working years he'd been paired, on more flights than anyone bothered to count, with a maintenance chief named Gwyn who used to check the airframe he rode in, and a bond formed in the back of a vibrating aircraft at altitude is a bond that doesn't read the retirement paperwork. When Gwyn cross-trained into the seat, Maverick simply came along. Unofficially, at first. Then less unofficially, because the thing about that dog was that he was steady in a way that did something to her she couldn't fully explain and didn't try to. Here's what she could explain. In the air, when the weather got rough and the airframe started doing the thing airframes do when they're being asked questions they don't like, when the average pilot's heart rate climbs and the hands tighten and the breathing goes shallow and fast and the whole nervous system starts screaming the oldest message there is, we are going to die, Maverick's breathing didn't change. He sat in the right seat or down in the well, and he breathed slow and even and deep, the way a thing breathes when it has decided, all the way down at the bottom of itself, that it is exactly where it's supposed to be. And she'd learned to breathe with him. That's it. That's the whole secret. There's no magic in this story, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending there is. The dog couldn't read a radar. The dog didn't know the front from the floor. But a body in a storm takes its cues from the bodies around it. And the calmest body in the aircraft sets the tempo for all the others. And the calmest body Lin Gwyn had ever flown beside was a gray-muzzled Labrador who breathed like nothing in the world could touch him. The 4 pilots flew with their training. Gwyn flew with her hands, her airframe, and her dog's lungs. The duty officer told her to leave him at the door. So here is the question, and I want you to actually hold it for a second, because the whole night turns on it. What makes a person walk toward the wall that 4 better credentialed people just walked away from? It would be easy, it would be cheap, and I won't do it, to make this a story about a brave woman and 4 scared ones. That's not what it was. The 4 who said no were doing their jobs, and their jobs included the discipline to refuse a mission the book said would kill you, and that discipline keeps more people alive than recklessness ever has. If you take nothing else from this, take that, the people who said no were not the villains. There are no villains in this one. That's what makes it different. That's what makes it harder. The thing that made Gwyn different wasn't courage, exactly. Courage is part of it, but courage alone gets you killed, and the flight line is full of memorials to brave people who flew into weather that didn't care how brave they were. What made her different was that she was the only person in that room reading from a different book. The 4 pilots read the book of what the average aircraft can survive, and that book said no, and they were right to obey it. But Gwyn had spent 9 years writing her own book, in grease and torque values and 2 in the morning diagnostics, a book that only she had ever read, and her book said something the others couldn't. Her book said this specific airframe, flown this specific way, by hands that know exactly where its margins really are, has perhaps a sliver of a chance. Not a good chance. A sliver. The kind of sliver the official book rounds down to 0 because the official book has to be written for everyone, and everyone can't fly the way she could. She wasn't braver than the 4. She just knew something they didn't, and what she knew lived in her hands. And 6 people were going to die in 38 minutes. She looked at the duty officer. She looked at the board, at the magenta wall, at the little marker that was a downed team and 6 fading souls. And she looked down at the gray-muzzled dog sitting at her heel, breathing slow and even ready, the way he'd always been ready, in the back of every shaking aircraft she'd ever kept in the air. And the dog looked back up at her. And something passed between them that no clipboard in the world has a column for. The radio crackled, and a voice came through it, and the voice changed everything in that room, not because of what it said, but because of how it said it. You can tell a lot about how bad a situation is by the voice of the person calling it in. There's a register men reach when they've stopped expecting to be saved and started simply reporting the facts. A flatness that comes over the words when hope has quietly left the building, and all that's left is the discipline to keep transmitting. This voice had that flatness. It was a young man's voice, and it was steady in the way that costs everything to keep steady, and it gave the grid coordinates and the casualty count and the time remaining on a tourniquet that should have come off 20 minutes ago, and then it said the thing that the duty officer would carry for the rest of his life. "We understand the weather," the voice said. "We're not asking anybody to die for us. We wanted to say it on the net. So somebody hears it. We held the position. We did the job. Tell our families we did the job." And then the voice went quiet, not because the radio failed, but because the young man had said what he'd called to say, and there wasn't anything left after it. I want you to understand what just happened, because it's a thing that almost never gets said out loud. That young man had done the math on his own life and the lives of the 5 people with him, and he'd come out the other side of the math. And he was using the last of his radio battery not to beg but to make sure that when they were found, somebody would know they hadn't quit. He was writing his own epitaph over a military frequency so that the record would be right. That's not panic. That's the opposite of panic. That's a man so far past fear that he's already gone ahead to the part where he's gone, and he's just trying to leave the place tidy. The room heard it. The 4 pilots heard it. The duty officer heard it. And every single one of them felt the exact same thing, which was the specific particular agony of a professional who knows that the right call and the bearable call are not the same call, and that he is going to have to live inside the gap between them. The 4th pilot, the last one, the most senior, the one whose no carried the most weight, set down his headset. He was a good man. I keep saying that about the people who said no, and I keep saying it because it's true and because the truth is harder than the lie. He'd flown more weather than anyone on that line. He had a wife and 2 kids and a 30-day countdown to a retirement he'd earned with interest, and he looked at that board and he looked at the magenta and he did the thing that 30 years of staying alive had trained into his bones. "I can't put a crew in that," he said. "I won't. You send people into that front, you're not running a rescue, you're running 2 funerals instead of 1. He turned to the duty officer, and his voice cracked just slightly on the last of it, the only crack any of them would show. "Log my refusal. And God forgive me. And here's the thing, he was right. Read that back. He was right. With the crew he had in the airframe configured the way it was, flying the way trained pilots fly, that front was a death sentence with rotors on it. His no was not the failure in this story. His no was wisdom. His no was the accumulated weight of 30 years of watching brave people die, and it deserves your respect, not your contempt, and if I told you to sneer at him I'd be lying to you about how the world actually works. The tragedy of that room wasn't that good people said no. The tragedy was that being right and saving them were, that night, 2 different things, and only one person in the building could see the sliver of space where they weren't. Nguyen didn't make a speech. I think that's the part that surprised them most later, when they reassembled the night in their memories and tried to find the moment the decision got made. They kept looking for the moment, the declaration, the defiance, the line in the movie where the underestimated hero plants her feet and announces what she's about to do. There wasn't one. People who actually do hard things almost never announce them. The announcement is for the people who want credit for the courage without paying for it. The ones who pay just go. She unclipped her flight gloves from her belt. That was it. That was the whole speech. She pulled her gloves on one and then the other, working her fingers down into them the way you do 1,000 times until the motion lives below thought, and the duty officer saw her do it and understood, a half second too late, exactly what it meant. "Chief." He stepped toward her. "Chief, I gave you a direct." "You logged 4 refusals," she said, not loud, not even looking up from her gloves. "You don't have a 5th crew to refuse with. You've got a closed mission and a closing window and a bird on the line that nobody's flying." She looked up then. "I'm not asking you to send a crew into that. I'm telling you I'm flying a single ship that I maintain myself, that I know to the last rivet, and I'm the only person on this installation who knows that exactly. You can log it however you want. Reckless. Insubordinate. Write whatever covers you." She zipped the second glove. "But you cannot stand there and tell me that bird can't make it, because you don't know that bird. I do. I built half of what's holding it together with my own hands. And that, I built half of what's holding it together with my own hands, landed in that room like a door opening. Because every person in there had spent their whole careers treating the airframe as a given. A tool, A thing that arrives fueled and ready and gets handed back when you're done. And here was the one person who saw it from the other side. Not the user of the machine. The keeper of it. The one who knew which of the book's red lines were real walls and which were just paint. The duty officer opened his mouth. And closed it. Because somewhere underneath the clipboard and the regulation and the entire architecture of who's allowed to do what that he'd spent his career enforcing, a small honest part of him had just understood that she might be telling the truth, and that he had no way to prove she wasn't. And then the dog made the decision for all of them. The ground crew had the bird turning by then. Somebody down there had heard enough, or maybe just couldn't stand to be the one who didn't, and the rotors were coming up to speed and the whole machine had started its low full-body howl. And Maverick, who had been sitting at Nguyen's heel through the entire exchange, still as furniture, rose up off his haunches without a single command being given. He didn't look at the duty officer. He didn't look back at the warm, dry operations shack and the soft bed his retirement had earned him. He walked out across the apron toward the open door of that screaming aircraft, gray muzzle into the rotor wash, ears flattening, eyes narrowed against the blast, and he put his front paws up on the deck and hauled his old body into the right seat the way he'd done it 100 times in a younger life. And he sat down, and he faced forward, and he waited. For her. Nobody had told him to. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that the duty officer would describe years later, still not quite able to make it fit the way he understood the world. There was no command. There was no leash. There was a retired old dog who had every reason and every right to stay on the warm side of that door, and he chose the storm instead, because she was going, and a long time ago the two of them had made an agreement that didn't have words in it and didn't need them. Where you fly, I fly. When it shakes, I breathe. You bring us down. I'll keep us calm. The duty officer looked at the dog in the cockpit. And something in his face changed. This isn't a petting zoo, he'd said, 20 minutes ago, like the dog was a joke, like the dog was the punchline to how unserious this whole thing was. And now he stood on the apron and watched that same dog climb voluntarily into a machine that 4 combat pilots had refused to touch, sit down, and wait, calm, certain, ready. And I think it was the first crack in something that had been solid in that man his whole career. Because dogs don't read the regulations. Dogs don't know who's allowed. A dog just knows where it belongs, and where it's needed, and who it would follow into anything. And that dog had just answered the weather call. The officer didn't say leave the dog again. He never would, ever again, as long as he lived. Nguyen crossed the apron. She didn't run. I want you to see her not running, because it matters. She walked into that rotor wash with the unhurried economy of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and has no need to perform the doing of it, head down against the blast, flight bag over one shoulder, and she came around the nose and climbed up into the left seat beside her dog. She pulled the door. The howl dropped to a roar. She strapped in, 5 points, snug, the buckle finding her hand without her eyes, and she ran the start sequence the way you run a thing you could run in your sleep, and probably had every gauge of face she knew, every needle a friend reporting in. And beside her, the dog breathed. Slow. Even. Deep. Unbothered. The calmest body in the aircraft, setting the tempo, the way he always had. She put her hand on his head, just for a second, just one, and the dog's amber eyes came around to her, and he gave her the look. The one that had no words and didn't need them. The one that said, I'm here. We've done this. Fly the bird. Okay, she said to him, to herself, to the 6 people 31 minutes away who didn't know yet that anybody was coming. Okay, old man. Let's go bring them home. She brought up the collective. The bird grew light on its wheels, then lighter, then loose, that magic transitional second where a machine stops being a thing on the ground and becomes a thing in the sky, and she turned the nose toward the magenta wall, toward the weather that 4 better men had said no to, toward the part of the night that was going to try its level best to kill them. And she flew into it. The wall did not look like weather from the inside. From the operations shack it had been color on a screen, magenta, red, the tidy language of radar that turns death into a palette. But weather doesn't know it's supposed to be a color on a screen, and when the bird crossed from the ragged edge of the clear air into the body of the front, the change wasn't gradual and it wasn't gentle. It was a door slamming. 1 second there was sky, gray and ugly but sky, and the next the windscreen went white and then black and then nothing, the kind of nothing that has texture to it, rain coming sideways so hard it stopped being rain and became a single moving substance, a river standing on its end, and the noise of it on the airframe was a thing you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. And the bird moved. Not the way a bird moves when you move it. The way a thing moves when something bigger has picked it up. The first gust came up onto the left side and threw the whole machine sideways and down at the same time, a sickening diagonal drop that took the floor out from under everyone's stomach, and the instruments spun to catch up with a reality that had changed faster than they could read it. And somewhere in the airframe the metal made the specific sound that Nguyen had heard at 2 in the morning under a flashlight. The complaint, the "I don't like this." And she heard it, and she knew it, and she did not panic, because she knew exactly how far that complaint was from the scream that comes right before something breaks. That's the gap again. That's the whole thing. To anyone else in that seat, the sound the airframe just made was the sound of dying. To her it was a sentence in a language she'd spent 9 years learning, and the sentence said uncomfortable, not fatal, and the difference between those two words, read correctly, in the dark, at the worst possible moment, is the difference between hauling back in terror and overstressing the very thing that's keeping you alive, and trusting it, and writing it, and letting the machine do the thing it was actually built to do under the line the book draws too conservatively because the book has to keep the average pilot alive. She didn't fight the gust. She rode it. Let the nose go where the air wanted, then fed it back, gentle, the way you bring a frightened animal around instead of wrestling it. The 4 pilots would have been right to fear this. They'd have fought it with everything they had, because that's what their training screamed, and the fighting would have been the thing that killed them. Nguyen flew it like she was apologizing to it. Beside her, the dog breathed. I need you to hold both of these things in your head at once, because they were happening at once, and the whole night lived in the space between them. On one side, a machine being assaulted by a sky that wanted it dead, metal complaining, instruments spinning, rain like gravel, the airframe heaving through angles it was never advertised to fly. And on the other side, in the right seat, an old gray-muzzled Labrador, braced low and easy on his haunches, ears back not in fear but in the simple sense of a creature reducing his surface to the wind, breathing. Slow. Even. Deep. And here's the thing about a human nervous system that no flight manual will ever print, because it isn't a fact about aviation, it's a fact about being an animal. When everything in your body is screaming the oldest message there is, we are falling, we are going to die, do something, do anything, the single most powerful countersignal in the world is the calm of another living thing beside you. Your breath wants to go shallow and fast. His was slow. Your heart wants to climb into your throat. His wasn't moving. And a body in crisis, given a calm body to lean on, will borrow that calm, will sink to it without permission, will let the slower rhythm pull the faster one down toward the ground where decisions get made instead of up into the white noise where people die. She'd told a flight surgeon about it once, years before, and he'd nodded politely and written something down and clearly thought she was describing a comfort, a superstition, an emotional support animal. He'd missed it completely. It wasn't comfort. It was regulation, physiological, mechanical, real. The dog wasn't making her feel better. The dog was lowering her heart rate, steadying her hands, widening the tunnel that fear tries to close, buying her back the half-second of clear thought that the storm kept trying to steal. Every gust that came up under that aircraft was an argument that they should panic, and every breath out of that dog was the rebuttal, and she flew the whole front on the rebuttal. The book gave the 4 pilots their no. The dog gave Nguyen her yes, not as a feeling, as a function. He kept her at the bottom of herself, where her hands knew things her terror couldn't reach. She reached over without looking and put 2 fingers against his shoulder, just to feel it. The slow rise. The slow fall. Still here, old man? The slow rise. The slow fall. Yes, she said. Me too. Then the storm tried, in earnest, to kill them. It came as a wind shear, which is the thing that turns careful pilots into statistics, a sudden violent change in the wind's direction and speed across a few hundred feet of altitude, so that the air giving you lift 1 second is dropping out from under you the next, and your airspeed, the number your whole survival rides on, falls off a cliff while you watch. The bird had been clawing through the body of the front, holding, writing her gentle inputs, and then it hit the shear and the airspeed indicator unwound like a clock with its mainspring cut and the low rotor warning lit the cockpit up red and the whole machine started to settle. Not fly settle, the obscene downward mush of a helicopter that has run out of the air it needs to stay airborne. Dropping toward terrain she couldn't see in weather that wouldn't let her find it. This was the moment. This was the exact configuration of factors that the duty officer had been right about, that the 4 pilots had refused to put themselves inside of, the death at the center of the magenta made real. Low rotor. Falling airspeed. Settling toward unseen ground. Every reflex in a trained pilot's body says the same 2 things, and they are both wrong, and they will both kill you. Pull up on the collective to stop the fall, and haul back on the cyclic to slow the descent. Pull and haul. Every instinct. Both fatal. Pulling the collective with the rotor already low drags the RPM down further, and you trade the last of your lift for nothing. Hauling back bleeds the airspeed you don't have. The storm offered her both poisons and made them feel like the cure. And the dog breathed. Slow. Even. In the half-second where her body wanted to do the two things that would have ended it, the slow rhythm beside her held her down at the bottom of herself, in the place where her 9 years lived, and her 9 years did not reach for the collective. Her 9 years did the unthinkable thing, the thing the panicking body refuses, the thing only knowledge that lives below fear can do. She pushed the nose down. Toward the ground she couldn't see. Toward the thing every cell in her was screaming to climb away from. She traded altitude she didn't have for airspeed she desperately needed, dumped the nose into the fall and let gravity give her back the speed the shear had stolen, fed in just enough collective to keep the rotor inside the margin she knew, the real margin, her margin, not the books, and held it there, in the screaming red heart of it, descending on purpose into a storm, while the low rotor warning blared and the airframe complained and the rain came like gravel and the altimeter she couldn't trust unwound toward a number that meant impact. And the airspeed came back. It came back the way a held breath comes back, all at once. A gasp of it, the indicator lifting off its stop and climbing, the lift returning to the blades, the settling slowing, stopping, reversing, the machine becoming a flying thing again instead of a falling one, and she eased the nose back up out of the dive with the speed in hand now, hers again, flyable again, and leveled into the body of the front with maybe, she'd never know exactly, maybe a couple 100 feet of black air left under her where the ground had been waiting. She'd flown a helicopter down to keep it from crashing. It's the most counterintuitive thing in the discipline, the maneuver that the body fights hardest and the textbook teaches last, the one that demands you do the precise opposite of every screaming instinct in your spine. The 4 pilots knew it too, it was in their training, the same as hers. But knowing a thing in a classroom and doing it in the black in the sheer, with the warning blaring and the floor gone and death 2 seconds away, are separated by a gap that fear fills up for almost everyone. The dog's slow breathing kept the gap from filling. That's not a metaphor. I told you at the start there's no magic in this one, and I meant it. A calm body lowers the heart rate of the body beside it. A lower heart rate widens the window of clear thought. A wider window let her reach her training instead of her terror. Plain biology, doing the most important job of the night. The 4 pilots flew with their nervous systems wide open to the fear. Nguyen flew with an old dog breathing the fear back down to a size her hands could work around. Good, she said. Just that. Her voice flat, level, the flatness of a person operating right at the edge of everything and refusing to let it show, because showing it costs energy she didn't have to spare. Good. We're good. The dog's amber eyes came around to her. The slow rise. The slow fall. I know. I never doubted it. The grid was close now. She could feel it more than see it, the math of heading and time running underneath her hands the way it always did. And the worst of the front was behind them. Not gone, never gone, but behind, the wall thinning toward the ragged far edge where the team was down and the window was closing and 6 people were counting whatever they had left to count. The radar in the operations shack, miles back, had her as a single contact eating its way through the magenta, impossibly, a marker that should not have still been moving, and the men watching it had stopped talking entirely. She keyed the radio. Any station, this is rescue, she said, into the storm, into the dark, into the flat, hopeless silence where a young man had recorded his own epitaph 40 minutes ago. Inbound to your location. ETA 4 minutes. Get your people ready to move. For a long moment, there was nothing. Static. The white noise of a sky that didn't want her there. And then that same young voice came back on the net, and it did not have the flatness anymore. The flatness was gone. The flatness had been the sound of a man who'd stopped expecting to be saved. And what came through now was the sound of a man who, against everything, against the weather and the math and his own grim certainty, had just heard an engine in the dark. Say again, rescue? The voice cracked clean in half. There's somebody coming? I'm 4 minutes out, she said. Hold on. Somebody's coming. And beside her, in the right seat, the old dog breathed. Slow. Even. Deep. The far edge of the front gave her back the world in pieces. It didn't open all at once. It surrendered grudgingly, the way a thing surrenders when it isn't beaten, only momentarily distracted, the white going gray, the gray going to torn ragged scraps of visibility, and through the scraps far below, a pulse. A single strobe. Somebody on the ground had pointed an infrared marker straight up into the murk and was holding it there, the last small defiant signal of people who had recorded their own epitaph and then, against all of it, heard an engine. She came down through the last of the cloud and saw the landing zone, and her stomach dropped a second time that night, not from the air, but from what the air had left her to work with. There was no landing zone. Not really. There was a notch in the terrain, a shelf of rock and scrub maybe a little wider than the rotor disc, walled on one side by a rise she couldn't see the top of and falling away on the other into a black nothing the storm had filled with rain. The kind of place you don't land a helicopter. The kind of place the book doesn't even have a page for, because the book assumes that if it's this bad you'll have the sense to find somewhere else, and there was nowhere else, and there was no time to want one. 6 people. 1 notch. A crosswind still clawing off the back of the front, gusting, shoving, never the same for 2 seconds running. She keyed the radio. I see your marker. That shelf, that's all you've got. That's all there is. The young voice, steadier now, steadier because there was a job to do again, and a job is a thing you can hold on to. It's tight. I won't lie to you, ma'am, it's real tight. Then it's tight, she said. Get them lined up. I'm not going to be down long, and I'm not going to be pretty about it. When I'm on the deck, you load and you don't stop loading. And beside her, the dog breathed. Slow. Even. Deep. She brought the bird around into the wind, and she began the most dangerous thing a helicopter ever does, which is to stop flying and start hovering, low in turbulence, with the ground close enough to kill you and not enough room to recover from a single mistake. In open air with calm wind, a hover is the easiest thing in the world. In a gusting crosswind, in a notch the width of the rotor disc, with a rise on one side waiting to eat a blade and a black drop on the other waiting to eat the whole machine, a hover is 1,000 corrections a minute, every one of them a chance to die, the pilot's hands and feet in constant tiny argument with an air that will not hold still. The wind came off the rise and shoved the tail. She caught it. The wind died and the bird sagged toward the drop. She caught it. The rotor wash bounced back off the rock wall and tried to push her into it, a thing called recirculation that has killed pilots who had room to spare, and she had no room to spare, and she caught that too, fed in the corrections small and constant and unhurried. Her hands doing the math her conscious mind couldn't have kept up with, 9 years of knowing this exact machine pouring out through her fingers into the controls. And the dog breathed, and she breathed with him, and the breathing kept the panic small enough that her hands could work in the gap underneath it. She got it down. Not gently. There was no gently available. She got the wheels onto the shelf hard and held the bird there with the controls still fighting the wind, planted but not resting, 1,000-pound thing balanced on a knife's edge of her constant attention, and she did not relax a single muscle because the moment she relaxed, the wind would take it. On the deck, she called. Lo Jing. Go, go, go. And out of the dark and the rain they came. I want to slow down here, because this is the part the radar miles away couldn't show, the part that lived only on that shelf in the storm. 6 people. The young man with the steady voice came first, not because he was first in line, but because he was carrying the end of a litter, and on the litter was a man who could no longer carry anything, the one whose tourniquet had been on too long, the reason for all of it. They loaded him first. Then a woman cradling an arm that wasn't shaped the way an arm should be, climbing in one-handed, jaw set, making no sound. Then 2 more under their own power, soaked through gray-faced, hands reaching down to haul the next one up. Then the young man last, the way the ones who carry the voice are always last, counting his people into the aircraft with his eyes before he'd let himself follow them. 6. All 6. Through the open door into the shaking bird, while the wind tried to throw the whole thing off the shelf and Gwyn held it on the deck by sheer accumulated knowledge and would not let it go. The young man got a headset on, and the first thing he did, the very first thing before his own safety, before anything, was look forward into the cockpit to see who in God's name had flown into the front that four refused. And he saw a woman with her hands full of a fight he couldn't even perceive, and beside her, in the right seat, calm as a stone in a river, an old gray-muzzled dog watching the loading with patient amber eyes. He didn't understand what he was looking at. How could he? He just knew, the way you know a true thing before you can explain it, that the dog belonged there. That the dog was part of how this was happening. "Everybody's in," he called. "6 up, all secure, go." "Hold on," Gwyn said. "Everybody hold on to something. This part's worse than the way in." It was. Lifting off that shelf was harder than landing on it, because now she had weight, 6 lives worth of weight she hadn't had on the way down, and a wind that wanted to use that weight to swat her into the rock wall, and a drop on the far side that wanted to use it to pull her down into the black. She brought up the collective and felt the bird grow heavy light, that loose transitional second again, except this time it lasted too long, the loaded machine slow to leave, and a gust came off the rise at exactly the wrong instant and shoved the tail toward the wall, and for one full second the spinning tail rotor and the rock were closing on each other faster than seemed survivable. She didn't pull away. Pulling away was the instinct, and the instinct was death. Yaw hard from the wall and she'd swing the nose into the drop and lose her hover entirely. She did the small thing instead, the right thing. A precise stab of pedal and a breath of cyclic that walked the tail back from the rock by a margin she would never tell anyone the size of, because the size of it would have kept her up at night, and then she got the disc level and bit into the air and climbed. Out of the notch, off the shelf, up into the body of the storm she now had to cross all over again. This time with 6 souls aboard who'd done their dying already and now had to learn how to hope again on the way back through. The front fought her on the way out the same as on the way in. Sheer. Gust. The metal complaint she knew by name. But something was different on the return, and it took her a few minutes to understand what it was, and when she understood it she almost laughed. It was easier. Not because the storm was kinder. The storm was exactly as cruel. It was easier because the worst thing that can happen to you in a cockpit had already not happened twice, and a body that has survived a thing twice stops believing quite so hard in its own death, and the disbelief frees up something, a margin, a steadiness, and into that freed-up space the old dog's slow breathing flowed and filled it, and she rode the front home on the borrowed calm of a retired animal who had decided, all the way down at the bottom of himself, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. And then the way it had slammed shut behind her on the way in, the storm let go. The airframe stopped complaining. The rain quit coming like gravel and went back to being rain, and then quit being even that. The buffeting eased, smoothed, and the windscreen went from black to gray to a torn and ragged dark that had, impossibly, the faint far smudge of the installation's lights bleeding through the bottom of it. Clear air. Or clear enough. The kind of clear that, after where she'd been, felt like stepping out of a collapsed building into open sky. In the back, somebody started to cry. Not the wounded, or not only the wounded. The young man with the steady voice, the one who'd held it together through his own epitaph and the loading and the climb off the shelf, sat in the back of that aircraft in the sudden smooth quiet and finally let go of the thing he'd been carrying, and wept, the way men weep when the danger is past and the body cashes the check the crisis wrote. Nobody said anything about it. 2 of the others put hands on him. That's all. That's what you do. Ngwyn heard it through the headset, and she did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than what was happening, and because she had a wounded man on a litter and an installation to find and a landing still to make. But she reached over without looking, the way she'd done at the worst of it, and she put 2 fingers against the old dog's shoulder. The slow rise. The slow fall. We got him, old man, she said. Quiet. Just for him. All 6. We got him. And the dog turned his gray muzzle toward her, and his amber eyes found hers in the dim green light of the instruments, and he did the thing he had done 100 times in a younger life and would do now for the rest of this one. He leaned just slightly, just enough, the weight of his shoulder coming to rest against her arm. I know how it ends, the lean said. I always knew. You bring us down. I keep us calm. That was the deal. That was always the deal. She brought them down. The bird settled onto the apron the way a thing settles when the person flying it has nothing left to prove and nothing left to spend. Gently, exactly, the wheels finding the concrete like they were coming home, and she rolled the throttle back and the rotors began their long sighing wind down, and for a second, before any door opened, before anyone reached them, there was just the cockpit, and the dimming gauges, and a woman and a dog breathing in the dark. Then the world came running. Medics first, the way it should be. They hit the side door and the wounded started coming out, the litter handed down into waiting hands, the woman with the broken arm, the others, the young man last because of course he was last, and the apron filled up with a controlled, urgent choreography of people doing the thing they're best at. And for a few minutes nobody on that flight line had a single thought to spare for the impossible fact of how those 6 people had gotten there. They were just there. They were alive. The work was to keep them that way. Ngwyn didn't move for those few minutes. She sat in the left seat with her hand still resting where the controls had been, and she let the people who needed to run, and she did the thing that the body does when a long terrible focus finally releases. She shook. Just slightly. Just her hands. The fine tremor of a nervous system that had held itself at maximum for the better part of an hour and was now, belatedly, sending the bill. The dog leaned harder against her arm. And she breathed with him, one more time. Slow. Even. Deep. until the shaking stopped. Here is what did not happen next, and I want to spend a moment on it, because it tells you everything about what this story actually is. There was no cheering. In the movie, there's cheering. In the movie, the crowd parts and somebody starts to clap and it spreads and the underestimated hero walks through the applause in slow motion while the music swells. That's the movie, and it's a lie, and the truth that night was so much quieter and so much better than the lie. When Gwen finally climbed down out of that aircraft, stiff, soaked, the old dog hopping down behind her and pressing in against her leg, the flight line did not cheer. The ground crew who turned the bird for her, the medics catching their breath now that the wounded were inside, the handful of others who drifted out into the cold to see the thing they'd been told couldn't be done, they didn't clap. They went quiet. Every one of them. It was the quiet of people who have just watched something they don't fully have words for. It was the quiet that's deeper than applause, the kind you give a thing too large to make noise at. They looked at her, and they looked at the gray-muzzled dog at her side who should have been asleep on a soft bed somewhere and instead had flown into a front that 4 pilots refused, and the silence said the thing that no cheer ever could: we don't entirely understand what just happened here. But we know it was real. And we know we'll be telling it for the rest of our lives. And the 4 pilots stood at the edge of that silence. They'd come out too. Of course they had. And I want to be careful with them, the same as I've been careful the whole way through, because the easy thing is to put a sneer on this and I won't. They didn't look ashamed, because they had nothing to be ashamed of. They'd made the call their training and their judgment demanded. And that call was sound, and in 9 nights out of 10 it would have been the call that kept everyone alive, including the rescuers. They didn't look defeated. They looked like what they were, professionals who had just been shown the precise, narrow, almost invisible seam in the world where their sound judgment and the right outcome had come apart, and who were honest enough, every one of them, to stand there and look at it instead of looking away. The senior one, the 4th, the one who'd said "God forgive me," walked over to her. He didn't make a speech either. People who've actually done the work rarely do. He put out his hand. She took it. "I was right," he said. Quietly. Just to her. About the weather. About what it would do to my crew, in my bird, flown the way I fly it. I was right, and I'd make the same call again tomorrow. "I know," she said. "You were right. And you went anyway." He looked at her, and then he looked down, at the dog the same way the duty officer had looked down at the dog an hour ago, except where that look had been dismissal. This one was something else entirely. "You knew something I didn't. About that airframe. About yourself." A pause. "About him." "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then I owe you an apology I'm not even sure how to say. Because I've spent 20 years thinking the seat was the job and the wrench was the thing you did before the job." He shook his head. "I had it backwards. You didn't fly into that front. You knew your way into it. There's a difference, and I never understood it until tonight." And then the duty officer came out of the operations shack. He'd had the longest hour of any of them, because he was the one who'd said the word, "Maintenance doesn't fly combat," and "Leave the dog, this isn't a petting zoo," and he'd had to stand in that shack and watch his single contact eat its way into the magenta and not come back out, and not come back out, and not come back out, and then come back out with 6 souls aboard who shouldn't be alive. There's a particular kind of long an hour like that is. It's the long of a man being slowly, mercilessly shown the exact shape of how wrong he was. He walked up to her. He didn't have a clipboard now. His hands were empty, and I think that mattered, the empty hands, the man stripped of the prop he'd been holding when he drew the fence. "Chief," he said. "Sir." He looked at the dog. He'd called the dog a joke. A petting zoo. And he stood there now and looked at the gray-muzzled animal who had climbed into that cockpit under his own power because she was going, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the only thing that was big enough. "I'll never call you just a tech again," he said. "And I'll never call him just a dog." He swallowed. "I owe you both better than that. The whole flight line does. I'm going to spend a while figuring out how to be worth what you did tonight." And that was the reversal. Not him groveling. She wouldn't have wanted that, and he was too decent to perform it. The reversal was a man who'd built his whole understanding of the world on who's allowed to do what, watching that understanding come apart on a radar screen, and being honest enough to say so, out loud, with his empty hands at his sides. The dog, for what it's worth, leaned against the duty officer's leg too. Forgiveness, in the only language he had. "I told you at the start that I'd give you the after, and here it is, because the after is where the meaning of a night like that actually lives." The man on the litter, the one whose tourniquet had been on too long, the reason for all of it, kept his leg. It was close, closer than anyone wanted to put in writing, but he kept it, and a year later he walked, with a limp and a cane and a profanity for the weather every time it turned, into the ceremony where they pinned something on Wen's chest that the official record would describe in careful bloodless language that left out the dog entirely. The unofficial record did not leave out the dog. Because here's what the brass did. After the dust settled and the honest after-action reports came in and somebody with stars on his shoulders read the whole improbable thing and understood. The way the senior pilot had understood, that they'd nearly let 6 people die behind a wall built out of who's allowed. They didn't just decorate her. They did something better, something rarer, something that almost never happens in an institution built on the book. They changed. They made Chief Warrant Officer Lin Gwyn a senior instructor, put the woman who came up through the maintenance bay in front of rooms full of Academy pipeline pilots and had her teach them the thing the book can't, the difference between what an airframe is certified to do and what it can actually survive, the gap between fearing your machine and knowing it. The thing that lives in the hands. The thing 9 years under a flashlight teaches you that no classroom can. And Maverick. They wrote the dog into it. Officially. An old retired military working dog, gray in the muzzle, who should by every rule have been asleep on a soft bed. They cut an order that made him part of her crew, on paper, with a line item and everything, the institution bending its own rigid self around a truth it couldn't deny, that the calmest body in the aircraft sets the tempo for all the rest, and that some things that keep pilots alive don't fit in any column the book has ever printed. There's a tag bolted to the instrument panel of the aircraft she flies now. A military working dog tag, his, the real one. So that every pilot who ever sits in that left seat sees it and asks, and gets told the story, and learns the thing the story is actually about. Which is this. The book is almost always right. Obey it nearly every time, because nearly every time it's the accumulated wisdom of everyone who died teaching it to you. But know the difference between a wall and a fence. Know which of the lines drawn around you are real and which are just paint. And when the night comes, and a night like that comes for everyone eventually in some form, when the night comes that the right call and the only bearable call have quietly come apart, pray that you've spent your years becoming the kind of person who can tell the difference. The kind who knows their machine. The kind who has, somewhere beside them, a steady breathing thing that keeps them at the bottom of themselves where the knowing lives. For good pilots read the book that night, and the book said no, and they were right. One woman read a book she'd written herself, in grease and torque and 2 a.m. faith, and an old dog breathed her steady, and 6 people came home. Both of those things are true. Hold them both. That's the whole thing. One last thing, before I go. I've told you a lot of stories on this channel, and a lot of them have dogs in them, and people sometimes ask me why, like it's a gimmick, like I'm just reaching for the easy heartstring. And maybe sometimes it is easy. But I keep coming back to it, and tonight I think I finally know why, and it's this. Every single one of us has a storm we have to fly into eventually. Not weather, your storm. The diagnosis. The phone call at 3 a.m. The room where they tell you the thing you can't unhear. The night the right call and the bearable call come apart and you're the only one who can see the seam. And nobody can fly it for you. That's the brutal part. You have to be in the left seat. You have to have the hands. But the difference, the whole difference, the difference between the ones who make it through the front and the ones the front takes, is so often just this, whether there's a steady breathing thing beside you. A dog. A person. A voice. Someone who's decided, all the way down at the bottom of themselves, that they're exactly where they're supposed to be, right there next to you in the worst of it, leaning their weight against your arm. Not to fly it for you. Just to keep you at the bottom of yourself, where the knowing lives, where your hands can work in the gap underneath the fear. If you've got one of those, a maverick in whatever shape yours takes, go tell them tonight. Don't wait for the storm. Tell them. And if you are one of those for somebody else, if you're the steady breathing thing beside someone who's flying into their front right now, then you already understand this whole story better than I could ever tell it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sitting through the quiet parts with me, because the quiet parts are where the real stuff lives. If this one reached you, leave a word below. Tell me about your maverick. I read them. I read all of them. Breathe slow. Lean on each other. Know the difference between a wall and a fence. And I'll see you in the next one.